Let's do it.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome back to another critical conversation. I'm James, and we've got with us,
Yeah, your brother Nathir.
we've got the brother, I said the brother,
Yeah, well,
our brother, beloved brother
characteristically.
Nader. How you doing, man?
Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. Same as usual,
Alhamdulillah.
wallahi.
MashaAllah. Well, we're here with interesting, maybe unexpected news.
Yeah, subhanallah.
Remember, we were talking about in the CCN WhatsApp group was it was a bit crazy. We're of course referring to what's going on in Venezuela,
Mm,
and we're going to, inshallah, understand why this is important for us to understand as Muslims, but to be aware of what's going on. Somewhat scary. So, where are we starting
subhanallah.
then with this topic?
Subhanallah, subhanallah. It's important to give, an Islamic understanding of why we even care, right? Firstly, just to be aware of what's going on around you is important in Islam, especially if you want to be a person of influence, right? If you relegate yourself only to your sphere, then you're not going to be aware of things that affect it, kind of thing, right? And so, as
Mhm.
Muslims, even if something doesn't directly affect us, then sometimes it's important to be aware of it to know how there could be a trickle effect, right? Obviously, generally, geopolitics affects, everyone, kind of thing, right? And also it and I say this in terms of the political stance America has taken with respect to Palestine and Israel. It's important for you to know the strategies of your enemy, right? That's not explicitly designating anyone as anything necessarily, but that is to say that is to say that no, I mean it's obviously the famous saying of "know your enemy uh, better than." What is it? Keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. The meaning of which is that you should know your enemy, right? Because
Yeah,
your
no,
friend you can
no,
trust.
no, know thy enemy is a statement. I'm not sure
Yeah,
where it comes from, but it's certainly a statement. Know thy
Walaikum
enemy, and thy
walaikum
enemy
salam
cloak.
wa rahmatullah. And so, yeah, obviously, we have to know about also as one of the biggest world superpowers, maybe the biggest world superpower right now, America, right? It's important to know what they're getting up with, and that's just on the level of what's it called, of world politics, right? Oh, sorry, that's just on the level of why we should care about generally what's happening in world politics. But even Venezuela itself, there's so many parallels that can be drawn between it and Muslim countries, and we're going to see, how that touches on the Muslim world later on, inshallah. But first, let's give a brief history of Venezuela. It's important to understand, right? When I say there's parallels between Venezuela and Muslim countries, the most important parallel is the amount of oil that Venezuela has. It's actually
Okay.
yeah,
Oh
subhanallah,
wow.
right? Um, it's the most oil-rich country in the world, right? More than Saudi, more than Iraq, and so mashallah, yani, they've been on the doorstep of America for a long time. But Venezuela, obviously all of those countries in Latin America colonized by the Spanish, and then they went through a period of, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they went through a period where they were like very heavily exploited by America, right? And they had basically a bunch of puppet governments put in place where ultimately it was the American establishment that put in companies there that would, as exactly the British did in India, they would extract the resources, they would extract the money and take it back, send it back to the homeland, which being America in this case, and being at the time of British colonialism was England, right? And they would leave the inhabitants of the country poor. And that's, even before the oil was discovered, this is generally this is generally what empires do, right? Is that they generally, right? Generally, not all empires, but generally, what an empire does is that it takes the wealth and it sends it back home. And so they had dictators in power, and the people were, boiling, and the state of the people was getting in more and more. Let's say they were getting more and more unsatisfied with the state of affairs until, and I just want to, obviously there's huge history leading up to it, but I want to jump to the state of basically dictators in power, and then in 1958 there's a coup, right? And everything past this point is very, very influential into the state of Venezuelan politics now. So in 1958, there's a coup against dictators, or a dictator, that leads to a power sharing agreement between three major parties, right? Two of them being, one of them being basically a Catholic party, one of them being socialist, and or I forget the exact state of affairs, but basically, and there were a couple of things that were designated in this power sharing agreement. One of them is that, yes, is that you have to share the price, share the wealth that comes from oil, right? You have to share power between those parties,
Mhm.
and you can't let communists get into power, right? And so, in a sense, this was in certain ways this was a positive agreement. It was far better than the situation of the state affairs they had before, right? But at the same time, it still wasn't, it didn't take any. It was excluded the general public, and it was basically it was a government governed by an elite, branch an elite set of people, right? And the problem is they became very disconnected from the
Mm.
public. But for a while, it actually worked. And so Venezuela became very rich. I mean, it became the richest country per GDP. It became the highest GDP country in Latin America, in South America, right? So it was doing very well for itself, and that was largely because it had all of this oil, right? And then it was, taking the resources from its oil and spreading it out to the people, right? And this is generally a good strategy for any government to hold. But the problem is, and this is we're going to see the problem in Venezuelan politics through basically all of modern history, is that they've relied solely on oil for their wealth, right? Being the most oil-rich nation in the world, and you think it's a good thing to rely on, but it comes with problems when an economy is purely based on one particular asset. So, at the time it did very well, and Venezuela's golden years were in this period between 1958 and basically ended in 1982. And so we already mentioned the economy was purely built on oil. And so when the
Mm.
price of oil dropped dramatically, where the economy collapsed with it, right? Because that was all they had in their economy was the price of oil. And so what happened is that, and like we said, and it's a good principle by the government, right? But it led to certain negative consequences because their whole economy was based on oil. The government actually subsidized a lot of the things that the average person would pay for. So they subsidized transport, right? So transport was, a lot of it was paid for by the government. Oil is heavily subsidized by the government. So until the recent, until America just went in, from my understanding, the price of oil in the price of a gallon of oil, of petrol slash diesel in Venezuela, was 8 cents, 8 American cents, which is like, maybe 6 pence or something like that, right?
Right.
The price of a gallon of oil in America, of petrol slash diesel in America, is around $2.30. In this country, the price of a gallon is actually a lot more than that. It's about, we're talking about maybe £5, right? So way cheaper. Like it doesn't even, it's like it's about 100 times cheaper, right? But that's all through government subsidies. Why are those government subsidies so important? Is because the rest of the country is pretty poor, right? So they
Mm.
need these things to be subsidized for the rest of the economy to keep moving. People are poor, or people don't make a lot of money, but if nothing is expensive in the country, then that's fine, right? But at the time, so we're going back to 1982 now. We're not talking about now. 1982, the economy collapsed, and many people were relying on the government for subsidiaries, that being, transport, food, and oil, right? Food
Right.
subsidiaries. And so, especially food, when food security goes down, obviously there becomes rioting. And so the government had three options, right? Like any government has, when you're dealt, this sort of situation, when the economy collapses, right? To protect from civil unrest, there's three things or to protect your economy, right? There's three things that you do. Either you cut all public spending, and that's called austerity measures, and that's basically, if you heard about the international, the World Bank, what's the one that is,
World
lends a
Monetary
bunch of,
Fund.
yeah, the IMF.
Yeah. International Monetary Fund. That's
Yeah,
it.
the International Monetary Fund. That basically, it puts a lot of countries in debt, right? One of the big things they like to do is they like to force countries to take austerity measures, which basically means that you cut public spending to your people, right? And what is the purpose of a government if not right, to protect its own people. But anyway, so there's three options. Either they can cut public spending, which is the most logical, to be honest, because when the government loses money, right, then they have to, you know, they have to stop pay. They can't keep paying for the things that they were paying for before, right? And there's a whole, you know, discussion about this. Anyway, is that instead of this is the more Islamic framework when it comes to these things is that, and we mentioned this before. Sorry, is the system of awqaf, right, which is to set up a waqf or like a business that governs itself, right,
Mm-hmm.
with the money that you were going to give to charity. So, like, okay, uh, let's where obviously it's different in charity as it is in statecraft, but let's talk. Imagine they're both the same thing. Instead of that money that you were going to give to the people, right, invest it into a business that supplies its own money, right, and all of the profits of that business go towards the people. And the positive of that, the pro of that, is that now you have a something that generates wealth itself instead of just constantly spending, right?
Right. I mean that, like, I mean, even these awqaf, to the best of my understanding, were not centralized a lot of the time, and they were things that private individuals had been were encouraged to do as a sadaqah, that they would have a business, or they would have some kind of crop or something that was income generating, or in this way, and they would designate it for this hospital or this
Yeah,
school or this, for these public works or whatever it might be. And so it's different, perhaps, again, to the best of my understanding, it's different perhaps to what we see now of a kind of welfare state model, in the sense of everything is done by the central state, and that there were these sort of ongoing, for the public benefit, setups, but they weren't necessarily centralized. So you have that interesting kind of tidbit of
absolutely. No,
information.
that's no, subhanallah. You're right. The analogy isn't perfect here because actually, the Islamic state of governance encourages um the state to not interfere, to not be so involved, right? It encourages a level of autonomy for individuals and for regions. So for example, yani, in Islam, any haram action that you do in the confines of your home, the state has nothing to do with, right? If you brew alcohol in your house, and it's not to say that actually a lot of alcohol is haram for Muslims to drink, but if you brew alcohol in your house, the state isn't going to get involved in that, right? The government doesn't have the right to jump into your house, right? There's that famous story of Umar ibn Khattab where he overhears
Right.
someone
Mm.
drinking alcohol, and he jumps over into the man's garden, and the man says, "Hey, you're spying on me. That's you're not allowed in my house." And then Umar al-Khattab says, "Yeah, you got a point. That was the leader at the time, and he was told by a man, hey, you're not allowed in my house," kind of thing. Obviously, uh, it's
The
not the
kind of
governance that we see
surveillance state that we imagine in the modern world
now.
is antithetical to this kind of non-spying principle in the Sharia.
Exactly, subhanallah. But you're right in to say that, okay, obviously the system of awqaf is generally independent, right, of the government, and that comes with a lot of pros because that means that uh, things being funded isn't tangential on you being, a puppet of the current
Right.
regime in
It
power.
has financial independence, which
Yeah,
is why when the colonialists came, they destroyed this system, because how can they get access to the property and
absolutely, subhanallah.
these resources if you can't touch this income. It has to be for this hospital, but the colonials come in and put it all back on the market.
Subhanallah, they're thieves, right? But if you look at it, so what you're saying is very true, and that's actually why, like, obviously, ideally, and what would happen for a lot of Islamic history is that scholarship was funded through these awqaf, where the government
Mm,
wasn't involved,
mm,
right? But then,
mm.
and then you think, okay, fine, but when a new caliphate came into power, why wouldn't they just take over that waqf? Well, it was sacrilegious to do so, right? And it would be
Right.
like really, really bad for a Muslim caliphate to take over the waqf of someone else, right? This is a system set up from the very beginning of Islam. It's similar to them going against the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In a sense, it would be. And so for that reason, they were protected, right? And so for that reason, obviously, you don't want scholars to be on the payroll of the government, because that means that they will provide, rulings that are
That is
beneficial to
such
the
a key
government.
thing, that this kind of, again, that the ulama by and large were decentralized, and they were independent financially of the government. That they weren't, the stooges of the government. They weren't the sort of scholars of the sultan. Like, they were there to be representatives of the Sharia. And as you can see in the biographies of all of the four major well-known imams of the Sunni madhahib, that they all had their altercations with some kind of governance at some level, whether it was as big as Imam Ahmed radiallahu an, rahmatullahi alayh, who was going up against the caliph himself, or you have the others having skirmishes with governors and so on. But that was it's such a central part. The sort of criticism of corrupt clergy, this kind of idea is not really something you can apply to a traditional Islamic model, where
Yeah.
the scholars are disconnected from. They're there to hold the government to account. They're there to be, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's representatives, the representatives of the Sharia.
SubhanAllah, it's so true. And
I was
why it's important to mention this in the context of Venezuela is because actually Venezuela gets brought into the conversation of socialism versus capitalism / American imperialism. And there's a lot of valid points to be said here. Firstly, obviously, as Muslims, we're not socialists, right? Like we said, Islam is its own, it has its own paradigm, right? And in reality, Islam is the truth, right? And everything else is a deviation from that. We're not socialists and we're not capitalists. Obviously, Islamically, the idea of wealth sharing is already found within the Sharia anyway, right? And that wealth shouldn't be totally centralized in one place. That's already found in the Sharia anyway, right? A monopoly is explicitly haram, right? So it's not only illegal, it's immoral to have a monopoly in Islam, right? And that obviously is not allowed, like the government won't allow it, but also you're like, as a Muslim, if you think about having a monopoly, that comes with sins of the day of judgment, right?
Right.
So it's
The internal function of the taqwa will prevent you from that as well.
yeah, absolutely. And if not the power of the state. Now, obviously, a lot of the times in Islam, the self-accountability of someone before their Lord, right, will be the first line of defense that is generally enacted for most people that fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala before the state has to get involved, right? And so subhanAllah, it's obviously, it's part and parcel of being a Muslim. But so we're not socialists. We're obviously not, capitalists in the sense that, the whole purpose, the free market will govern itself. No, there needs to be governance of the markets, because otherwise exploitation can take place. And that's what we see, in all basically markets across the world, is that America has a bunch of super rich, companies, and just like a lot of capitalist economies basically. And those super rich companies push the little boys, push the little, the smaller companies out of business, right? And they buy the smaller companies, and they're always, and you see this, this is why we keep on seeing, for example, this is, we keep on seeing like the US government trying big American companies for monopolistic practices, right? So you'll generally see them getting fined for, you can't do this, this law has to be put in place here. It was done against Microsoft, it was done to Apple for a while, for a couple of things. So there's a push and pull game with the government of how much of a monopoly we can have without, you guys controlling us, kind of thing, without or you restricting us. And so, the famous, Peter Thiel, enemy of Islam, he's an enemy of all that's good and holy, right? Is the famous Peter Thiel, like his economic theory, and this is, let's say, very characteristic of the vast majority of capitalists, is that the whole purpose of your company and the whole purpose of business is to have a monopoly where you control all of the demand of that market, the supply of that market, and so obviously you can control demand with that, and so it is dangerous. But then there's also another aspect of American imperialism, right? Which is, it's separate slightly from the socialist capitalist talk. And what we're talking about here is, and this again leads into, us talking about the Khilafah, an Islamic system of Khilafah, is that American imperialism affecting the country was basically what happened is, and we spoke about this before, like very at the very beginning, is that Venezuela and a lot of Latin America, a lot of South America's economies had basically super rich American companies in their countries that were extracting the resources, giving very little wealth to the actual, inhabitants of the land, and shipping back most of the wealth back to their own country, right? And so what happened is that it was a huge system of exploitation against the people, and that's why, that's actually what we see now. That's why Donald Trump wants to invade, and that's why he did invade, kind of thing, is because he wanted those companies to come in, and we'll talk about that later. But we're now at the stage 1982, where the prices spike up, right? And there were three options that they do. There were three options that they could take. They could either cut government spending, which is austerity, right? When a lot of the people relied on that government spending, or this is Venezuela, or they could take more debt. But the problem is they'd already been amassing a lot of debt, up to this point when their economy was doing well, banking on the stability of the oil money that they're going to get, right? So they think oil's always going to be a commodity. We're always going to keep on exporting. We're actually going to export more and more oil, right? And so we might as well borrow money because we're going to pay it back anyway, right? Well, it came to bite them in the bum, because then oil prices collapsed, right? And then subhanallah, oil
Sorry,
prices
so
collapsed.
very
I didn't want to say the other one. I didn't want to say the other
vigorous
one.
speech. Yeah.
Yeah, subhanallah.
May Allah bless you, man.
I saw you smiling.
Keep it, keep it,
Okay,
keep it PG.
uh,
Keep it
at
PG.
the end of the day, it didn't pay off.
It didn't pay off.
And so subhanallah is that they couldn't take more debt, right? And then the other option was to increase taxes, but the people didn't even have the money to pay for, the subsidies that they were being given. And so what ended up happening is that they cut government spending, and that led to a lot of unrest within the people themselves, right? And in this light, Hugo Chavez, which, okay, most people know that right now, or the leader that was currently pulled out of governance was Maduro, right? Which was he was the prime minister or the president. I think he was the president of Venezuela, right? Before him, the person that he took over power from was a man named Hugo Chavez, and he's actually a very charismatic leader. He was quite a politically savvy leader in terms of geopolitics and the likes, right? Internally, though, not the smartest, or okay, let's get into it, right? Basically, he tried to have a coup in 1992, but that failed. 1992, right? And he basically, but they actually put him online. They actually put him on the TV, and he captivated the Venezuelan people, right? He captivated them enough that in 1998 they elected him, right? So he goes from having a coup that fails in 1992, another coup that fails, and I forget the exact year, and then in 1998 he's elected by the people. So he's not the typical kind of military dictator that we see. He was actually elected by the people. He won in 1998, right? And he was very, very popular, right? He was so popular that just like Erdogan, Erdogan a couple of years ago had a, they had an election in Turkey to increase the power of the government, right? Obviously, him being the leader of the government at the time, and the majority of people voted for increased power in the government, right? So the same thing happened with Hugo Chavez, right? Is that the vast majority of the Venezuelan people actually voted for him to have increased power because, they saw him as a leader that, brought stability back to Venezuela. And actually, when he took over, right, the economy shot up. Now, again, like, has been the case in recent Venezuelan history, is that their economy is purely based on the price of oil. So actually, the price of oil went up. Huh?
That's the kind of key consistent thing here is the oil.
Yeah, exactly. And so the price of oil went up, and so the economy went up. And it wasn't really heavily to do with Hugo Chavez, even though there was a cut there. He did do some very good things. The oil the oil, the oil sector was already nationalized in Venezuela, right? So it was already owned by the government. But he increased some extra measures. Also, what the Venezuelan people really don't want, right, is for a system to be like the system that they had been subject to in, late 1800s, early 1900s, which is that American companies come, rob them of their resources and give them the scraps, right? They want to, be the main beneficiaries of the wealth that's coming out of their country.
Sure.
Which doesn't sound, very crazy at all, right? And so Hugo Chavez comes and he represents the people, and he's he's not white, and he's anti-American imperialist in that sense, right? He wasn't anti-capitalist in his early days. He was more anti-American imperialist. And he was a good leader, but also he was piggybacking off the high prices of oil. He did very well for himself.
I mean, this is a lay person's question here. I think when it always comes to economics, this is outside my area of expertise. What is it that's affecting those prices of oil? Is this something that is connected to the American dollar? Is it like scarcity? Is that what's happening, or
it's more to do with scarcity? It's more to do with scarcity. So there's, for example, times where if America discovers a huge oil field, from my understanding, if America discovers a huge oil field in its own country, right, then that might cause the price of oil to go down slightly, right? It is actually quite in the modern world, it's quite a universal asset, but also people are moving away from it. So if you entirely rely on oil fields,
because it's going to be my point in connection to, again, Gulf countries whose historical, economic base has been oil. Now you see all of them really moving towards tourism as a primary sort of source of income.
So brother to the threads is saying, isn't the oil in Venezuela quite hard to extract too? Allah alam, it could be, maybe you know better than me here, right? But I'm talking about it more on a political level. But that's a good point compared to other countries I heard. Subhanallah, it could be, wallahi, right? But so going back to the politics of it, Chavez, this charismatic leader who actually against American imperialism, right? He dies in 2013, right? And he's succeeded by Maduro, right, who doesn't have any of the charm of Chavez and is basically only selected by Chavez. So Chavez actually selected him, right, because he was entirely loyal to Chavez, right? And he's not charming, and he's not competent either. He's not a good leader either. And what happens is that partially it's how much can you blame a leader when the whole country's economy is based on the price of one asset? And so really the country, how well it does is based on the price of that asset, right? And so actually Maduro takes over in 2013. In 2014, around that time, there was a huge plummet in the price of oil, right? Which caused the whole economy of Venezuela to basically get thrown to the ground. And subhanAllah, what ends up happening is that subhanallah, the Venezuelan people become very poor. Now, we already spoke about the three austerity measures the three measures that a government can take when its economy collapses. One of them is to cut public spending. One of them is to take debt, and all of them come with negative consequences. And one of them is to increase taxes. He didn't do any of them. What he decided to do, and it sounds so stupid because it is very stupid, is that he decided to print more of the money, right? He just increased the money in circulation.
Now that is something I understand from Germany in the 1920s.
Exactly, subhanallah. Subhanallah.
The value of the money goes down. Yeah.
Exactly. And so inflation took over, right? And his idea is that, okay, it's only going to be a temporal dip in the price of oil. Well, actually what ended up happening is that, oil went down and stayed down, right? And so he had to constantly print out money, and inflation really negatively affected the Venezuelan people, especially bearing in mind, we talk about inflation in terms of, let's say how much you can buy from the money that you have. And obviously that has an impact, especially if you have like a job that gives you a certain income, a set income, right? But then we think, okay, fine. But if the price of goods goes down, then also the demand for money is going to go. Sorry, if the price of goods goes up, then the demand for capital is going to go up. And so it's like, okay, if I have to pay 300 for a loaf of bread, 300 of whatever economy, then I'm surely going to be getting paid more than that, right, at my job. That's not necessarily the case, by the way, because sometimes just everyone's wealth is based on that, that previous standard of money, right? And now everyone's wealth drops down. But also, anyone that has savings, suddenly those savings disappear. So say, for example, you're a British person and you have, you know, £50,000 in the bank. Now that's a very sizable portion that would support your retirement. Maybe you want to invest it in something in the future. And then suddenly the economy takes a huge, goes down the drain. And then those £5,000 worth of spending end up in a year being worth, those £50,000 worth of spending end up being worth £5,000, right? Suddenly you have functionally lost £45,000 worth of money, right? Worth of value, right? And so it has a huge effect, right, on the wealth and the psyche and, the unrest of the general people. And Maduro's just been kind of playing a game of catch up. Now, that's to say, Maduro is actually now Chavez wasn't a smart guy. Oh, sorry, Chavez, he was very charming. Politically, he was smart, but in terms of looking after his country, he relied on oil too much, right? And actually, they say that he wasn't even interested in understanding the oil sector, of which constitutes basically all of his economy, and that's very dangerous, right? So, and he didn't even invest into renovating the oil the oil extraction facilities in Venezuela. And so, from that aspect, Hugo Chavez wasn't the best leader, but obviously, what can you expect? Maduro, on the other hand, is quite a bit worse, right? He's not a bad, again, I'm not pro-American imperialism by any sense, but he was actually quite a corrupt person. What he did is, like we said, they keep on printing money. So the average person who has no dollars, because he's relying on his government's currency, right? Because that's what everything is bought in. Like, James, you don't have any dollars, do you? Right?
No,
all of my money is in pounds. So if the British pound collapsed, right, then what would be our wealth would disappear, right? And that's the vast majority of the Venezuelan people. Maduro himself, though, right? Maduro himself had access to US dollars, and him and his inner circle had access to US dollars. And so what ended up happening is that they didn't suffer at all from the extra printing of the economy, right? They were still living lavish lives and actually making money out of it in a way that we'll explain very briefly in a second. But subhanAllah, the average person was struggling. And what actually happened is that the government set now, this is something it doesn't really make sense to do. The Chinese government does it as well, but the Chinese government, they have a heavy control of their currency, right? So it kind of makes more sense for them to do this, right? But in a totally free market sense, this doesn't actually make sense. What they did is they set a solid value, right, an unchanging value for the currency exchange from the Venezuelan currency to dollars, right? So it's basically, it was a 1 to 10. I think $1 gives you 10 Venezuelan currency or whatever, right? They said that, but the only people that could access that exchange rate was people in the government, right? People, basically Maduro's close circle, right? So basically Maduro's close circle wasn't impacted at all by the inflation, because they artificially buffed the value of their own Venezuelan economy, right? But everyone else suffered from it, and they had to exchange in the black market rates that you might have seen in Lebanon a couple of years ago, where basically the Lebanese, I don't know what their currency is called, but it was worth nothing basically. Domestically they had to change it, what's it called, to dollars on the black market, and it was really bad. And so that's what happened to Maduro. So he was kind of hoarding the wealth. Now what they could do is they could say, okay, fine, I have 100 Venezuelan economy, that's going to give me $10. I buy something with those $10, and then I sell them for 3 million Venezuelan economy, because everyone else is suffering, right? And they're actually experiencing inflation. So I suddenly get basically, it's a way of with one extra step in the middle, I can trade certain, I can trade my currency for even more of that currency, right? And they were robbing the people like that. And so, subhanAllah, obviously unrest built. The people weren't happy with them. That's to say that it's important to have a nuanced view. We're in no support of American imperialism, but at the same time, we don't support, corrupt systems themselves. Now, this leads up to...
I'm going to have to abandon you again.
Subhanallah. Subhanallah.
I think we must make sure to start our streams on time, I think. My fault is for not sending the link earlier,
Inshallah.
subhanAllah.
No worries.
But yes, may Allah put barakah in the rest of this, and I will see you soon, inshallah.
Bless you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam.
Okay, it's just us now. So, subhanallah, is that the Venezuelan economy? So, okay, there was unrest. So they don't like the Venezuelan people don't like Maduro, and rightfully so. He's a corrupt leader. Then what ends up happening is that okay, Donald Trump comes into power, right? And everyone knows what's happening, but let's just very briefly summarize it. Yeah, subhanallah. So on January the 3rd, so okay, there was kind of superficial tension being, boiled up. Why I say superficial is because we know that Donald Trump only cares about Venezuela for its oil. So there was this tension where Donald Trump was saying, "Hey, we're against," and the media was painting Venezuela out to be some sort of an enemy, harboring enemies of the state, and it was all constructed to basically give a reason for America to invade Venezuela. And so what happened is January 3rd, which is 4 days ago from now, right? In the evening of January 3rd, they did an operation called, I think it was Night Hammer, where they went into Venezuela, right, and kidnapped the Venezuelan president Maduro and his wife, right? And actually, no U.S. Soldiers died in that operation, and something like 18 Venezuelan soldiers, 18 Venezuelan, people that work for the armed forces were killed in that operation. And so they've extradited, or they've basically kidnapped Maduro and his wife. And why they've done this, they're claiming that Maduro is the three things that they accuse Maduro of, right? Is that he's harboring US enemies, right? Enemies from China and Iran and stuff like that. And it's reality, it's nonsense, right? Obviously Maduro and Venezuela does have good relationships with those countries, by the way, and because it's kind of a global network of socialist countries. So certain parts of Latin America, along with China, along with Iran and Russia, there's a mutual understandings, right? Civilians died there, subhanallah. Obviously America will never mention this, but civilians died obviously in this invasion. And similarly, in the case in the Muslim world, they don't care about the civilians that they kill, right? It's only how many of our soldiers died, right? Subhanallah, as if the value of the lives of their soldiers is more, as if obviously it's not, but subhanallah. But anyway, subhanallah, so sorry, they went in, kidnapped the President Maduro and his wife, and they're claiming that he's harboring enemies of the US, those being those kind of socialist communist leading allies, China, Russia, Iran. And they're also claiming that he's basically the head kingpin of some sort of drug cartel that's pushing drugs into America. No proof of this, right? And even though, yeah, sure, there might be drugs coming out of Venezuela, but there's also drugs coming out of Mexico, obviously, right? And a large parts of Latin America because of its proximity to the US and because it's the governments don't have power to regulate to that level, kind of thing. So obviously sometimes drugs do slip through the borders, right? But whether Maduro is responsible for this or not, it doesn't seem that there's any proof, but Allah knows best. Obviously, he's going to be, they're going to trial him, but the Americans are going to trial him. So obviously there's a conflict of interest there, but we'll see, subhanAllah. And then the last thing is that, okay, that even when they give a pretense, so for example, when they went to invade Iraq, and this is obviously very pertinent to our history, is that when they invaded Iraq, they gave the pretense of weapons of mass destruction. They knew that was a lie. We later found out that was a lie. When I say we, I mean, obviously, most people knew that it was a lie, but it was later admitted to the masses that, okay, by the way, there were no weapons of mass destruction. But why I say this is that generally when the imperialist powers go into a country, they invent some sort of high morality reason to go in, right? And in this case, they didn't even do that. And that says a lot about the state of American politics. I actually want to, subhanAllah, yes, I want to show you this this funny clip from some American. No. Subhanallah. What it basically does is it. Yeah, here we go.
in American history, when we intervene in another country, whether true or not, we come up with a high-minded pretense. Liberating a people, spreading democracy, introducing baseball to the Japanese. They complained at first, but it's totally worth it. On what moral foundation will this conflict be framed?
We're going to have presence in Venezuela as it pertains to oil. We're going to get the oil flowing the way it should be.
Seems a little on the nose. Oil, precious commodity, certainly, but not the reason a country formed 250 years ago on the ideas of liberty and self-determination would go into a country and snatch a man at night. There must be a slightly more noble pretense.
We're going to be taking out a tremendous amount of wealth out of the ground.
We need total access. We need access to the oil.
Sir, again, I see where we're going here. Do you mind just reframing that? I'm not quite clear on the high-minded principle behind this.
In other words, we'll be selling oil.
Is this your first war? I mean, what the f***?
And so, subhanAllah, you know, it's just, this is actually a very, very important thing, right? Is that the kind of the pretense of, and always we joke, you know, the famous memes about, oh, someone discovered oil, democracy incoming, right? Or welcome to democracy, where suddenly America's going to forcibly give them democracy, right? And we speak about this jokingly, but they used to have to give this pretense to kind of delude mainly their people into thinking that, hey, we're acting on some sort of moral reason. Like, obviously, what's the point? They don't care at all about Afghani women, right? But they want to attack Afghanistan, and so they say, hey, Afghani women aren't being educated. If they cared about women, then they wouldn't let women get killed in Palestine, right? But the dropping of this pretense shows that they're committed to going back to a world, right, pre-World War II, which you know, was more, let's say, Machiavellian in the sense that it was purely about self-interest of that empire, right? And so, you know, they would invade a country purely because it's got resources, we want to make ourselves richer. Now, they've been doing that for time immemorial, but the fact that they're so blazing with it right now shows that they don't have to hide it. And it shows that people are more accepting of that. The reason why, obviously, the whole idea of a rules-based order has been nonsense anyway, right? The concept of, oh, no, now the world is governed by the UN, and countries have to obey laws and international law. And we saw that this, obviously, the whole guise of this slipped after October 7th and the 2-year genocide in Palestine. But again, it's a further slipping of this. Like, it's a further demasking of that god of their idol of the rules-based order and international and the international, you know, let's say, accountability that is provided by the UN, is that the rules or the rules-based order is only as good, like, it only is effective when you're applying those rules to the non-superpowers, right? But the superpower will never allow the rules-based order to apply rules on it, right? So that's why we see the amount of times, obviously before October 7th, before the 2-year genocide in Palestine, that's why we saw so often that the US would veto a UN Council resolution. The United States would veto a United Nations, a UN Council resolution against Israel for, you know, let's say, invading the West Bank or bombing Gaza. And they would say, okay, everyone will get together and say, hey, you have to stop bombing Gaza. And the US would say, actually, no, right? You don't have to stop bombing it. And so it's this whole kind of guise of rules-based orders has slipped. And there is a good, that is good to a level. Why? Because it stops people from being deluded into thinking that, oh, actually, no, the US is moral and that Israel is moral and they're obeying international law. In reality, there is no international law being obeyed here. No one actually cares, right? America certainly doesn't, right? And they only keep up the pretense to, you know, for a sense of, you know, self-righteousness and to delude their people, right? But also the fact that the guys is slipping, like I said, it shows that the people are more willing to accept it's dangerous to say this. People are more willing to accept an imperialistic reason to invade another country, right? And why that's dangerous is that we already saw, just as we saw when the US was preparing to invade Venezuela, the American media basically started conjuring up some narrative of, oh, they're harboring US enemies, and oh, they're masters of some sort of they're the kingpin of some drug trade coming into America, right? And we see that exact same sort of narrative in the media against Iran right now. And why that's very dangerous, obviously, as Sunni Muslims, you say, okay, why do you like Iran? Why that's dangerous is because it is suggesting that the US is trying to find another reason to go into Iran and actually take over its oil reserves, just as they did with Venezuela. Now, it's a lot easier to do in Venezuela because they're a lot closer to Venezuela. And also, regionally, they actually have a lot of allies in the region, right? Iran is not the same. And Iran has the backing of a far closer ally, being Russia and China, those more communist allies, right? Why this is very important, and why the US is jumping at the opportunity to claim oil reserves now is actually some people, subhanallah, sorry, is that some people Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, so I was just thrown off by something, is that America, and as most of you know, that the price of the dollar is pegged on the value of oil on the global economy. Why? Because America doesn't allow for anyone to buy or sell oil except in the US dollar, right?
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Don't say my name, but
Yeah, fair enough. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so we have a nameless brother from the audience here,
Yes.
helping us out. Barakallahu feek. And so, brother nameless, if you have anything that you need to say, then obviously feel free to interrupt. But basically, as some of you might be aware, obviously the US, one of the reasons for the strength of the US dollar is that it doesn't allow anyone to trade oil except in the US dollar, right? And we're talking about huge trade between countries, right? Why that's significant, why that's very significant, is that it means that anyone that wants to buy oil has to engage in the US economy, and which keeps the US economy strong, right? And it's a way of basically enforcing Western hegemony in the region, right? Enforcing Western power, across all of the globe, right? Recently, what's happened is that actually Saudi did a deal with China to sell oil in the digital yuan, which is basically some sort of Chinese currency. And the same was done with Iran, from my understanding, right? And so, and India, or was it India? I think it was India that did the same, that traded on the Chinese economy. And so why this is very dangerous is that it threatens the very bedrock of the strength of the US economy. Actually, the dollar, the strength of the dollar is the bedrock of it, the foundation of it is based on the oil trade that goes on all around the globe, right? And they were forcing people to buy and sell oil in dollars, right? And actually, you might have heard of the famous Libyan leader Gaddafi, right? Gaddafi was an evil man, but the one thing that he did that was actually good is that he wanted to make a unified African currency, right? That was independent entirely of the dollar, and that's what they would trade their oil in. And Libya is a huge exporter of oil, right? So that would strengthen Libya, but it would also strengthen its African allies and its African neighbors, right? When that was what a lot of people are saying. That was why a lot of people were saying that the US suddenly hated Gaddafi, even though they don't care about, humanitarian people's, they don't care about human rights. They don't care about, the humanitarian state of any country, right? But why they hated Gaddafi is that, and why he was a threat to them, is that he wanted to start trading in an African currency. Now, they have gone to wars to stop people trading in or buying or selling oil in anything other than the dollar. That's how important trading oil in the dollar is to the US and its economy. And obviously, a large part of its global political influence is through its wealth. And so if you strip away its wealth by taking away the bedrock of basically the source of the strength of the US dollar, then you take away its political power also. And that's very dangerous, and the US can't be having it.
Have a question.
Go for it, brother.
So, will America have boots on the ground like they did in Iraq? If not, why?
In Venezuela or in Iran?
In Venezuela. So you know how they invaded Iraq in 2003. So will it be like that, or will it be a more limited operation? And if it's more limited operation, what could the consequences of that be?
Okay, Allah alam exactly if they're going to have boots on the ground or not, right? But what even Donald Trump has been saying, and inshallah we wanted to watch a video, is that basically, and I'm going to give a little bit of a background before, right? The way something that, you know, let's say, actually a lot of empires have done in the past, right? And something that we see the UAE doing now, which is very intelligent, is that instead of them having their own assets in a certain area controlling something, they fund or they prop up certain, you know, let's say in the case of the UAE, it's militias like the RSF and like, you know, southern militias in Yemen, and that was the whole reason for the UAE Saudi split that happened recently, right? But instead of them necessarily having boots on the ground, they could prop up a leader that is entirely subservient to their interest. And so actually what's happened now is that Maduro has been, you know, obviously kidnapped, so he's out of power. But the government voted in a leader that basically a successor of the Maduro government, right? And she is compromising with the US, but she's also trying to give a bit of back and forth, basically saying that, hey, we're not going to be puppets to you guys. And Donald Trump is saying, hey, we'll go in again if you're not puppets to us. If you don't comply with our standards of basically letting American companies in to extract your oil, then we're going to we're going to kick you out of power. But sorry, Shamir, one second. I just want to finish with the note of why the US is desperate to have all of these extra oil reserves now. Is like we said, because China and Saudi and other countries and India and countries are moving towards trading oil in different currencies now, right? That threatens the strength of the US dollar, and for that reason, right, the US now has to look for its own oil reserves to prop up its own, because obviously, you know, it's going to then force people to trade its oil in the US dollar, and that's going to, you know, it's a temporary way of maintaining its strength, right? And so that's one of the reasons why they were so desperate into going into Venezuela, and one of the reasons that suggests that they might go into Iran, right? And Donald Trump was actually speaking about, now Iran, the reason for Iran is twofold, right? Obviously, their servitude to Israel, right? But then also the oil reserves, meaning that, subhanAllah, you know, obviously that increasing American power in the region. Now, you were talking about would they actually have boots on the ground? Functionally, it doesn't make that big of a difference, right? In terms of the PR of it, it probably wouldn't be very good if they had boots on the ground, right? But either way, they're going to be enforcing American interests. And like Donald Trump said it explicitly, is that they have to be letting American companies in, American oil companies in to, you know, he's doing it with this weird sort of pretense of basically saying we're doing it for the oil and we want the money from it, right? So he's being explicit in there, but he's also saying, oh, the Venezuelan people will also benefit from that, and they will also the standard of living. He said the biggest beneficiaries are the great Venezuelan people. Yeah, and it's obviously a bunch of saving face and nonsense that he's just saying to appease people.
Okay.
But subhanAllah,
Another
go for
question.
it, brother.
What does this mean for the rules-based order and a multipolar world?
SubhanAllah, what we can say is, and I'm sure that most people are aware, is that the rules-based order is a joke anyway, right? And it has been a joke for a long time, right? So if you look at, for example, in Bosnia, around 30, 40 years ago, right? The rules-based order and the UN was shown to be a joke back then. Right, in Bosnia, they called the UN the United Nothing, because they came in and they promised the Bosnian people something, and then they let the Bosnian people get massacred. So the rules-based order, and obviously we know for time immemorial, the rules-based order has been allowing Israel to get away with blatant war crimes and blatant disregard of international law, right? Because the powers at the time are negating it. And the whole point of a rules-based order is that you hold everyone accountable regardless of their wealth and regardless of their political influence. The reason for this is obviously many, but that causes basically, it's otherwise we just have a rule of the jungle kind of thing where it's like, okay, the strongest person wins. And that's kind of how we've been operating anyway, right? Is that the way that, politics is being played is that there's a surface level kind of saving face of the rules-based order and international law. But in reality, everyone in politics knows that no one really cares about this, right? And so, we saw this during the Cold War between the Soviet Union and America. And we see that obviously when the complete devotion to Israel in terms of whatever it does, it can never be guilty, even though the blatant disregard of the international law and condemnation from those exact systems that you claim to be upholding, being the UN, being the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, having explicit arrest warrants on Netanyahu's head, right? And so we know that the rules-based order hasn't been being followed, but the blatant disregard of it now, that brazen disregard of it now, could empower other countries to disregard it also, right? So in the likes of, for example, China and Taiwan, right? Why would China not invade Taiwan? It's the rules-based order, it would be against international law. And something that for some reason, I should have mentioned, to be honest, is that this is in blatant disregard of international law. What America is doing in Venezuela right now is a blatant disregard of international law. They've entered a country militarily without any reason to do so. So according to the international law, you're only allowed to militarily attack a country if either in self-defense or if a council of UN partners basically agrees, right, allows it to happen, right? There has been no such thing, right? And so we're basically seeing that, it's something that we knew, but it's like a more brazen slap on the face, right? And that could encourage other countries to just entirely disregard international law and the rules-based order anyway.
So we're going to be living in a more chaotic sort of world. So last question, inshallah, and then the floor is yours. So why should I, as a Muslim, and why should Muslims care about this? This is two non-Muslim countries fighting each other. Why should Muslims care about this specific this specific crime, let's say? Barakallahu
feek, bro. I really I appreciate the questions. It's very good, very, very good questions, because it allows, it's very pertinent to our viewers, right? Is what's the point? Like we kind of mentioned this at the beginning, but what's the point of a Muslim caring about international politics? On the note of what we mentioned at the beginning, it's partially to know your enemy, right? And in the sense that obviously the US has been doing things very very counter to Islam, especially in the Middle East, right? And so it's to know what they're willing to do and know what strategies they do and what they're going to stoop to, right? Now, they don't even care about blatantly disregarding international law. So let's not be surprised if they bomb one of our countries, right? Entirely unprovoked. So that's one thing, right? Another thing is that to know the general state of global politics, right? To know what's happening around you obviously informs what we could do as Muslims, right? And also there's a level of it which is a Muslim should be calling out injustice wherever it happens. And so this is a case of injustice against two oppressors, fighting each other kind of thing, two unjust people fighting each other, one could say. It's true, right? But one thing that can be said is that Venezuela has been very pro-Palestinian in the past, right? It's a very pro-Palestinian country, and the reason why a lot of those Latin American, Southern American countries are very pro-Palestinian is because they've been subject to the exact same American imperialist interventionism that the Muslim world has been subject to, right? And so they see the footprint, they see the fingerprint, of American involvement in the Middle East, and they recognize what happened to them, and obviously they condemn it. Similarly, for example, to the Irish people, right? Ultimately, we have loyal to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger, right? And anyone that submits to that has our loyalty, right? And otherwise, our loyalty is, like we said, to Allah's Messenger, and through that it's to the haqq, right? It's to the truth, right? And so part of the truth is upholding justice. And so where there's injustice, even if it's being propagated against a non-Muslim, right? It's Muslims should be involved, right? If we have, the power to do anything, right? But where we don't have the power to do anything, at least be aware of what's going on around the globe, right? And so, yeah, inshallah, that's actually finishes it quite nicely. Is that it's a very, subhanallah, it's just that brazen, and I guess this also has a big impact on the Muslim world in general. Is that if they're going to be that, blatantly disregarding international law, right, and the rules-based order when it comes to Venezuela, then let's not delude ourselves. For Muslim countries, let's not delude ourselves in thinking that we could, make allies with these people. And oh no, they have to obey laws, and they have systems, and they have constructs that keep them accountable. Those systems and constructs keep them accountable as much as they allow them to keep them accountable, as much as they want. As much as they want. You're compromising the stream, bro. You're a distraction. But subhanAllah, as much those rules only get applied as much as the powers that be want them to be applied. And as soon as they don't want them to be applied, they're thrown out of the window, right? So that's important to note. It's shone through the facade of that fake facade of international politics, of that rules-based order and international law. And like I said, it's important for Muslims to know, to inform their strategies and what they want to do in how they treat America as a power in the future, right? أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. We were blessed with two guests today, James, our brother James, and our brother
James is the host.
Sorry. We were blessed with the presence of James and the presence of this brother that shall not be named. So barakallahu feekum, brothers, thank you for attending, and inshallah we will I won't be here next week, but our brother James will be continuing, and then in 2 weeks we alhamdulillah, inshallah, will be honored to have Sheikh Dr. Anas al-Takriti, a very famous political analyst and someone that's mashallah has done a lot for international politics. So inshallah, please send through any questions in the comments that you would have for him, and something that we can signpost to ask him very early on. Barakallahu feekum, and wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam.